I wanted to add a few things and a few slides for the next edition of the art history course. And I noticed there were 3 slides from the presentation I did not mention, so this is a good moment to do it now. And these are the slides by a French artist called Gustave Doré, who could be seen as a kind of French equivalent of George Cruikshank. He was a book illustrator, very respected, and he illustrated things like the Bible, so you can't really go further in your career as a book illustrator than that in the 19th century. And on one occasion he visited London, and he was basically appalled by what he saw, the overpopulation, the squalor, the poverty, the pollution in the city of London. So he responded to this by producing a series of engravings called London, a Pilgrimage. Gives you a kind of moral vibe to the whole story, and I think it was very deliberate. You do a pilgrimage to holy places, and this was definitely a very unholy place. So here we have three images from this cycle. So the first one shows a street scene in London, the place called Ludgate Hill. As you can see, a terribly crowded street with lots of people, carriages, even a train coming over a viaduct in the distance. You can see some spires of churches and the big dome of St. Paul's Cathedral, but it's all covered in soot and smoke and smog generally. So that's really the kind of London that that the poor people especially were experiencing in the 19th century. Another image from Gustave Doré's cycle shows a back street with cramped little working class houses, again with the viaduct in the distance with the train passing, and the tiny small courtyards at the back that could be used for drying the laundry, but of course the smog and pollution would cause the laundry to go dirty before it was dry. So that's the bad living conditions for the working class in London. The last one, showing the place called Seven Dials, is perhaps the most shocking because it shows a crowd of small children playing unattended in the street, left to their own devices because their parents of course have to work, and this was a common occurrence in the 19th century among the poor, to leave the children, and of course the numbers of those children were absolutely humongous, and lots of them died before actually reaching adulthood because of the malnutrition and all kinds of diseases. So we have like this crowd of almost homeless children, and definitely unattended children in a poor area of very central London. If you check the place called Seven Dials on the map, it's in central London, just a short walk from all the fashionable and rich areas. So something I'd like to draw your attention to when we talk about the life of the poor people depicted in the 19th century in Victorian art, it's very often drawing the attention of the viewers to the children, to the underprivileged, to those who are seen as innocent victims of the of the social situation. Especially the children were seen as the subject that would potentially convince the middle class viewing public of the art exhibitions to to donate more money to charity. You may recall when we talked about Hogarth, the portrait he painted of Captain Thomas Coram, the founder of the Foundling Hospital in London. The institution was still working, probably more than ever, and there were lots of abandoned children and orphans being given to the care of this institution. And one more thing I'd like to add this semester, and to draw your attention to another aspect of the life of the poor and the artistic response to it in the 19th century, is the fallen woman. So basically the sex worker, the prostitute. You can also trace it back to Hogarth. All those social themes are very easily traceable to the art of William Hogarth in the early decades of the 18th century. We have Harlot's Progress, if you remember, the story of a country girl coming to London and being lured into the life of prostitution. And Hogarth was quite sympathetic towards the plight of this woman and women like her. And so were many artists in the 19th century. This was definitely going against the mainstream Victorian morality, which saw the sex worker, or as they called them, the fallen woman, as the guilty party, as the temptress and the immoral character who was completely to be blamed for her misfortune. This is something very typical for Victorian morality. It's basically victim blaming, if you think about that. All those poor women who were basically forced into prostitution because of abject poverty they lived in, they were seen as the Victorians put it, the great social evil. So of course not much, if anything, was said about the clients of these sex workers, and of course the fact that in the Victorian society, especially in the cities, the numbers of prostitutes were enormous, was mostly due to the demand for their services and the clients. So we see some artistic response in the press illustrations, in the cartoons. They sometimes make kind of fun of it. So we have a cartoon from the illustrated press from the magazine Punch, showing a kind of kindly gentleman, probably some sort of religious preacher, approaching a woman in the street and trying to offer her help to get out of sex work, and she is just waiting for a bus. So a woman alone in the street was very unusual and potentially immoral. I mentioned George Cruikshank's The Bottle and the follow-up, The Drunkard's Children, and I'll show you here two plates from this. So showing the life of the daughter of the unfortunate drunkard who became a mad criminal in the original set of the Bottle. So his daughter slides down into the life of vice, and I mentioned it already. A fallen woman quite often becomes a falling woman. She throws herself to her death from one of the bridges in London. So the last plate shows her actually falling to her death from the bridge, and this was a kind of cautionary tale, like if you engage in immoral life, this will lead to the early death, possibly to suicide, which was seen as a very immoral thing in its own right. But some artists believed that these women were not really to be blamed for their misfortune, and we have some Victorian examples showing the sex workers in a more sympathetic light. Sometimes these are the artists from the circle of the Pre-Raphaelites. They all included the themes of the fallen woman. So Dante Gabriel Rossetti and John Everett Miller and William Holman Hunt, they all include the subjects of the fallen woman in their work. We'll talk about the Pre-Raphaelites next week, so we'll have more examples, but just to show you Rossetti's Found. So here we have an old acquaintance, perhaps an old sweetheart from the country. He's wearing very distinctive country folk clothes, finding a woman he once knew as a streetwalker in the city. We have William Holman Hunt, The Awakening Conscience, a kept woman, so a mistress of a gentleman, experiencing some sort of spiritual awakening. And this is an interesting painting. We'll talk about it probably next week. Just to draw your attention to a little detail: the cat and the wounded bird under the table in the room where the man and this unfortunate fallen woman are portrayed, and some more images showing the destitute women walking the streets, like in John Everett Miller's The Bridge of Sighs. So here we have this connection of the fallen woman and the bridge. Sometimes she's just looking at the river, perhaps contemplating suicide. Sometimes she is living under the bridge, like in Augustus Eggs, Past and Present. This was a three-part cycle showing the downfall of an adulterous woman. So in the first painting, try to Google it. Her infidelity is discovered by her husband, who finds some compromising letters. In the second painting, you see her two daughters being unhappy and missing the mother and basically abandoned. We know from the description added to the painting that the father died as well, so the children are on their own. And this is the third one of Past and Present. We have the present state of the unfortunate woman actually living under the bridge with an illegitimate child. This is an interesting thing. We'll return to this in a little moment. And another Victorian artist, George Frederick Watts, Found Drowned. So here we have the outcome of the unfortunate life of the fallen woman. She drowned herself, probably throwing herself off the bridge. I mentioned the illegitimate child, and this brings us back to Thomas Coram and the Foundling Hospital. And if you remember, when I first talked about it, I mentioned that this was the institution of charity sponsored by the artists quite a lot. They had their own gallery of paintings, and William Hogarth was one of the first patrons of the Foundling Hospital. the idea that motherhood could be the saving grace of the fallen woman was very much within the moral worldview of the Victorians. So we have two images here, one by Ford Madox Brown, whose work called Work you saw earlier in this week. It's an unfinished painting showing a fallen woman with her child actually coming to the home of her seducer and saying, what is the title of the painting? Take your son, sir. She looks very ill, probably consumptive, probably dying, but she cares for her baby and she wants her child to be to be raised by the rich man who is the father. This painting, if you do not really know, it's a Victorian painting showing a fallen woman. It almost looks like a religious painting of Virgin Mary and baby Jesus. Behind the woman, we see this kind of round golden frame, which looks like a halo on the image of saints in traditional religious paintings. If you look close, this is actually a mirror. A round mirror hanging on the wall behind her, and if you look even closer you can see the reflection of the man in this mirror, looking quite puzzled but still extending his arms to meet the child she is trying to force onto him. The other one is by a female artist, Emma Brownlow, who was very closely connected to the Foundling Hospital, and this is one of the works she did for them. I think she was a daughter of the director of the hospital, something like that. She was really closely connected, and this shows a very, very rare scene: the foundling restored to its mother. So we have the child that was given up by an unfortunate, desperate woman to be raised in the orphanage, and a few years later probably the woman mended to improve her situation, to leave the life of vice and immorality, and perhaps to be financially secure enough to come and reclaim her child. So she loved her child all along, and this makes her definitely a much more moral person than the stereotype of the fallen woman as the great social evil, the spreader of venereal disease, worthy of, I don't know, suicide at least. So of course it didn't happen very often. There were just a few cases in the long history of the Foundling Hospital when the mothers returned, but I guess some of them hoped they could do that, because they very often left little tokens with the babies, like parts of fabric or something, like a small token that they would recognize even a few years later, if they were able to come and reclaim their children. So there we go. This is the industrial themes, the Regency, and the life of the poor. And next week we'll talk about the Pre-Raphaelites. Thank you.